July 10, 2006, 11:30 at night. The air in Boston is thick with summer humidity, but inside the D Street portal of the Ted Williams Tunnel, it is cool, dark, and silent. Mylna Del Val, a 38-year-old mother of 5, sits in the passenger seat of a silver Buick Centurion. Her husband, Angel, is at the wheel. They are heading to Logan International Airport to pick up relatives, driving through the crown jewel of American engineering, a multi-billion-dollar subterranean miracle that promised to fix the city's broken heart. In a single, deafening heartbeat, the ceiling vanishes. 26 tons of concrete slabs, held aloft by nothing more than chemical glue and arrogance, tear away from the roof. The sound isn't a crash, it is a tectonic shift. 10 massive concrete panels smash onto the Buick, flattening the passenger side into a jagged pancake of steel and glass. Angel is pinned, the steering wheel crushing his chest, staring into a wall of gray stone where his wife used to be. He survives by 3 inches of space. Mylna is killed instantly, crushed under the weight of a system that valued speed over human life. This was the Big Dig's final, brutal tax. How does a project meant to save a city end up burying its citizens? And why did the people in charge know it was going to happen years before the first bolt slipped? To understand why Mylna Del Val died in a dark tunnel in 2006, we have to go back to the nightmare that birthed the Big Dig. For 40 years, Boston was a city under a shadow. That shadow was cast by the Central Artery, a hulking, rusted, elevated 6-lane highway known to locals as the Green Monster. Built in the 1950s, it was a scar of green-painted iron that sliced through the historic heart of the city, cutting off the waterfront from the North End and the financial district. It was designed to carry 75,000 cars a day, but by the 1980s, it was groaning under the weight of nearly 200,000. It was a vibrating, exhaust-choked parking lot. If you lived in Boston, you didn't just drive on the Green Monster, you suffered through it. The accident rate was 4 times the national average. It was a labyrinth of tight exits and blind merges where cars were frequently rear-ended or forced off the road. Beneath its girders, the city was dying. The streets were dark, filled with the smell of diesel and the constant, rhythmic thrum of tires on metal joints. Boston was gasping for air, and it needed a savior. That savior came in the form of Fred Salvucci. If the Big Dig is a monument to anything, it is a monument to one man's obsession. Salvucci was the transportation advisor to Governor Michael Dukakis, and he had a vision that seemed insane at the time. He didn't want to repair the Green Monster. He wanted to kill it. He wanted to tear down the elevated highway and bury the entire interstate system beneath the city streets, creating a series of massive tunnels that would move traffic underground and leave a sprawling green park on the surface. It was a beautiful promise. It was a promise of light, of reconnecting the city to the sea, and of reclaiming the urban landscape from the tyranny of the automobile. Dukakis loved it. The city's elite loved it. It was a legacy project, the kind of engineering feat that would put Boston on the map alongside the builders of the Panama Canal or the pyramids of Giza. But there was a problem. The price of that beauty was a check the city couldn't cash on its own. In 1987, the Big Dig became a battleground for the soul of American infrastructure. The project was estimated to cost $2.8 billion, a staggering sum at the time. President Ronald Reagan looked at the proposal and saw a classic case of democratic tax-and-spend lunacy. He called it a local project masquerading as a national priority. Reagan didn't care about Boston's traffic jams. He cared about the federal deficit. He vetoed the highway bill that contained the funding for the Big Dig, calling the project a boondoggle. But Reagan underestimated the political machinery of Massachusetts. Tip O'Neill, the legendary Speaker of the House and a son of North Cambridge, made it his life's mission to secure the funding. O'Neill knew that if he could get the first shovel in the ground, the project would become too big to fail. He whipped the House into a frenzy, and in a historic showdown, Congress overrode Reagan's veto by a single vote in the Senate. The floodgates were open. The federal government was now on the hook for 90% of the cost. The dream was alive, but it was built on a foundation of political warfare and financial deception. Because here is the truth they didn't tell the public in 1987. That $2.8 billion price tag, it was a lie. Internal memos and early engineering assessments already suggested the real cost would be closer to $10 billion, and eventually it would balloon to over $24 billion. The architects of the project knew that if they told the truth about the cost, the public would never allow it to start. So, they engaged in a systematic campaign of lowballing and creative accounting. They pitched a bargain and delivered a debt that would take generations to pay off. They focused on the miracle of the engineering, distracting the world with the sheer scale of the task. And the scale was truly terrifying. Imagine trying to perform open-heart surgery on a patient while they are running a marathon. That was the big dig. The engineers had to tunnel under a city that was nearly 400 years old, filled with colonial-era foundations, ancient wooden pilings, and a spiderweb of utility lines that no one had bothered to map in a century. They had to move 15 Egyptian pyramids worth of earth over 16 million cubic yards of dirt, all while keeping the city's commerce alive above them. They had to freeze the ground using massive refrigeration plants to prevent the historic buildings in the south end from collapsing into the pits. They had to build slurry walls, digging deep trenches, and filling them with a bentonite clay mixture to hold back the swampy soil of Boston's harborside land. But as the machines began to grind and the pits began to yawn open, the human cost started to manifest in ways that weren't on the blueprints. The pressure to maintain the schedule and keep the budget from appearing as bloated as it actually was led to a culture of cutting corners. The project was managed by a joint venture of two massive firms, Bechtel and Parsons Brinkerhoff. These were the giants of the industry, the men who built dams and nuclear plants. In Boston, they were given unprecedented power to oversee themselves. It was a recipe for disaster. When you have a private contractor overseeing the work of other private contractors with taxpayer money, the first thing to go is accountability. The second thing is safety. While the politicians gave speeches about the Rose Kennedy Greenway that would one day replace the Green Monster, the workers were descending into a hell of mud and shadows. They were working hundreds of feet below the water table, held back by walls that sometimes leaked and groaned under the weight of the Atlantic Ocean. The noise was constant, a screaming chorus of jackhammers, drills, and heavy machinery that echoed in the confined spaces of the tunnels. They were breathing in dust, exhaust, and the chemical fumes of the resins and epoxies used to hold the ceiling panels in place. It was in these early years of the 1990s that the seeds of the 2006 collapse were sown. The design for the ceiling of the D Street portal called for heavy concrete panels to be suspended from the roof of the tunnel using steel bolts anchored into the concrete with a specialized epoxy. It was a simple design, but it relied entirely on the integrity of that glue. During construction, concerns were raised about the type of epoxy being used. There were two types, a fast-setting red epoxy and a slower-setting standard epoxy. The fast-setting version was prone to creep, a terrifying engineering term that means the glue slowly loses its grip over time under a constant load. Records would later show that the contractors were warned about the creep. They were told the fast-setting epoxy wasn't meant for long-term overhead loads. But in the rush to finish the section, in the drive to meet milestones and collect bonuses, the warnings were buried. They used the fast-setting glue anyway. They gambled with the weight of 26 tons of concrete, betting that it would hold just long enough for them to move on to the next section. The public didn't see the slipping bolts or the leaking walls. They saw the big dig as a spectacle. They watched as the massive can-opener machines chewed through the earth. They saw the incredible feat of the Leonard P. Zachem Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge rising over the Charles River, its elegant cables looking like a harp stringing the city together. It was a marvel of aesthetics, but beneath the surface the project was rotting. The cost overruns were becoming a national scandal. By the mid-90s, the project was burning through $2 million a day. Every time they dug a hole, they found something they hadn't planned for, a forgotten subway tunnel, a colonial graveyard, or toxic soil that cost a fortune to remediate. To keep the federal money flowing, the project managers had to keep the vision alive. They had to keep promising that the end was just around the corner, that the promise of a new Boston was worth any price. But the price wasn't just being paid in dollars. It was being paid in the lungs of the workers who spent 10 hours a day in the subterranean smog. It was being paid by the residents of the North End, who lived through years of vibrating foundations and rat infestations as the earth was turned inside out. And it was being paid by the integrity of the engineering profession itself. When the Big Dig finally started opening sections to traffic in the early 2000s, it was hailed as a triumph. The Green Monster was finally coming down. People cheered as the rusted iron girders were cut away, revealing the sky for the first time in half a century. The city felt lighter. The promise was being fulfilled. Angel and Milna Del Val didn't know about the epoxy. They didn't know about the 1987 budget lies or the creep in the ceiling bolts. They were just two people driving home on a Monday night, trusting that the ceiling above them was as solid as the ground beneath them. They were the victims of a vision that became an obsession, a project that was so big it became unaccountable. When those bolts finally gave way, it wasn't an act of God. It was an act of negligence that had been decades in the making. The epoxy didn't just fail in 2006. It was failing the moment it was injected into those holes in the 1990s. As we look at the gleaming tunnels of Boston today, we see a city transformed. We see the parks and the waterfront, but we must also see the cracks in the walls. We must see the thousands of leaks that have plagued the tunnels since the day they opened. We must see the billions of dollars diverted from schools and transit to pay for a highway that was outdated before it was even finished. And we must see the names of those who were sacrificed for this progress. The Big Dig was sold as a way to let Boston breathe, but for many it became a tomb. The vision was grand, the promise was beautiful, but the reality was built on a foundation of deceit. And as the project moved from the planning boards to the mud-choked pits of the construction site, the true cost began to emerge. Because the tragedy in the D Street portal wasn't the first time the Big Dig took a life. It was just the most public. In the dark, wet tunnels beneath the city, the bodies were already piling up. They called it the anthill. From the surface, the Big Dig looked like a chaotic scar across the face of Boston. But beneath the asphalt and the salt air of the harbor, it was a vertical city of sweat and iron. A subterranean labyrinth where the air was thick with the stench of diesel exhaust and the weight of an entire metropolis pressed down from above. To build the most complex highway system in the world, the contractors needed a specific kind of man. They needed thousands of them. The workforce was a living map of the region's bloodlines. You had the South Boston crews, men from Southie who had grown up in the shadow of the old, rusting elevated central artery, finally getting their hands on the beast that had choked their neighborhood for decades. You had the North End Italians, many of them second or third generation tradesmen, whose families had been displaced when the original highway was built in the 1950s. They were there to fix the mistakes of the past, or at least, that is what the brochures said. But the most specialized work belonged to the sandhogs. These were the elite deep rock tunnelers, many of them brought in from New York City because they were the only ones with the stomach for the abyss. They were a breed apart, men who spent their entire lives working in compressed air, miles away from the nearest ray of sunlight. In the anthill, these different tribes clashed and converged. It was a high-tension environment where the paychecks were fat but the air was thin. The culture was one of extreme machismo and even more extreme exhaustion. Because the project was billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule, the pressure to produce was relentless. The contractors, Bechtel and Parsons Brinkerhoff, pushed a 24/7 schedule that turned the human body into a machine. Working 100 feet below sea level is not like working on a standard construction site. In the deep trenches of the Big Dig, the environment was actively trying to kill you. The soil of Boston is a nightmare for engineers. It is a mix of glacial till, blue clay, and organic muck that has been marinating in industrial pollutants for 2 centuries. When the excavators bit into the earth, they released gassy, soil pockets of methane and hydrogen sulfide that could suffocate a man in minutes. The ground was often so unstable that it had to be frozen with liquid nitrogen or stabilized with slurry, a thick gray mixture of bentonite clay and water that looked like liquid concrete. Men worked knee-deep in this freezing mud, the walls of the trenches held back by massive steel braces that groaned under the pressure of the surrounding ocean. The first major sacrifice to the harbor came in August of 1996. Raymond Abbott, known to his friends as Ray, was a 34-year-old commercial diver. In the hierarchy of the Big Dig, divers held the most dangerous jobs. They were the ones who had to go into the pitch-black waters of Boston Harbor to inspect the massive concrete tubes of the Ted Williams Tunnel. On that Tuesday morning, the water was a freezing, murky soup. Visibility was zero. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You worked by touch, feeling the cold steel and the rough concrete, listening to the sound of your own breathing through the umbilical line. Ray Abbott was working inside a flooded cofferdam, a temporary enclosure used to pump out water so construction could happen in the dry. But something went wrong. In the darkness and the silence of the harbor floor, Ray became trapped. The details of his final moments are a claustrophobic nightmare. He wasn't killed by a sudden explosion or a falling beam. He was claimed by the freezing darkness, unable to extricate himself as his oxygen supply became a ticking clock. When they finally pulled his body from the water, it was a stark reminder to every man on the project that the Big Dig didn't care about your experience or your skill. The harbor was a cold, indifferent master. Despite the tragedy, the project didn't skip a beat. The schedule was God, and the God was hungry. By the late 90s, the Big Dig had entered its most frantic phase. This was the era of the golden handcuffs. To keep the unions from striking over the increasingly dangerous conditions, the contractors flooded the site with overtime. Laborers were pulling in 80, 90, or even 100 hours a week. It wasn't uncommon for a man to take home $3,000 a week in 1998 money, but that money came at a steep price. Psychological toll was shattering families across New England. Fathers became ghosts. They would leave for the hole before their children woke up and return long after they were asleep, their skin stained gray by the slurry, their eyes bloodshot from the diesel fumes. This exhaustion led to what the local papers would later call the Summer of Blood. In 1998, the safety culture of the Big Dig collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. On May 21st, the violence moved from the mud to the sky. Brian Heffernan was a 34-year-old ironworker. He was a man of the heights, part of the crew building the Leonard P. Zachem Bunker Hill Bridge. The Zachem was intended to be the crown jewel of the project, a stunning cable-stayed bridge that would become an icon of the Boston skyline. But on that spring morning, it was just a place of death. Brian was working on one of the massive bridge towers, 40 feet above the decking. In the world of ironwork, 40 feet is a routine height, but the Big Dig was never routine. A momentary lapse, a slip of a foot, or perhaps just the sheer fatigue of the 100-hour work week took its toll. Brian Heffernan fell. There was no safety net to catch him, no redundancy to save him. He hit the concrete below with a force that ended his life instantly. He left behind a family and a void in the tight-knit community of tradesmen who were building the city's future. The bridge that tourists now photograph for its beauty was paid for in part with Brian's blood. Less than 2 weeks later, the anthill claimed another victim. If Brian's death was a tragedy of the heights, Pasquale Sarni's death was a tragedy of the depths. Pasquale, known as Pat, was a 54-year-old laborer from the North End. He was a veteran, a man who had seen it all. On June 3, 1998, Pat was working in a deep trench near the intersection of Congress and Purchase Streets. The heat in the trench was stifling, trapped by the high slurry walls and the lack of airflow. Above him, a massive piece of excavating equipment was in motion. In the cramped confines of the tunnel, there is no such thing as a safe distance. A mechanical failure, or perhaps a miscommunication between the operator and the ground crew, caused a heavy metal bucket or counterweight to swing loose. Pat Sarni never had a chance. The equipment crushed him against the wall of the trench. His fellow workers, men he had known for decades, had to witness the brutal reality of a human body being broken by the very machines they used to build the city. The Summer of Blood should have been a turning point. It should have been the moment the federal government stepped in and demanded a halt to the project until safety protocols were overhauled. But the Big Dig was too big to fail. The political pressure from Washington and the Massachusetts State House was immense. Every day the project was delayed cost millions of dollars in interest and inflation. The contractors began to view these deaths not as failures, but as the unavoidable cost of progress. They used the high wages to pacify the unions, essentially buying the silence of the workers with hazard pay. You have to understand the atmosphere of the worksite. It was a war zone. The noise was constant, the grinding of the tunnel boring machines, the hiss of pneumatic drills, the shouting of foremen over the roar of the ventilation fans. The men were operating in a state of permanent fight or flight. When you are 100 feet underground and you hear the steel braces start to groan under the weight of the city, your instinct is to run. But you can't run. You have a job to do. You have a mortgage to pay, so you put your head down and you keep digging. This environment created a unique kind of trauma. The Big Dig widow became a recognized phenomenon in the suburbs of Boston. These were women whose husbands were technically alive and providing well, but who had effectively lost them to the project. The divorce rates among the Big Dig crews skyrocketed. Substance abuse became a rampant, unspoken epidemic. Men would finish a 12-hour shift in the hole and head straight to the bars in Southie or the North End to drown the claustrophobia and the fear in a bottle of whiskey. They were building a world-class infrastructure project, but they were tearing their own lives apart to do it. The culture of the project was also deeply segregated. While the unions were powerful, the most dangerous, backbreaking work often fell to the newest immigrants or those with the least seniority. There was a clear racial and social hierarchy in the anthill. The plum jobs operating the heavy cranes or the specialized machinery were guarded by the established families. The men at the bottom of the trench, the ones literally hand-shoveling the toxic muck and slurry, were often the most vulnerable. They were the ones who breathed the most fumes and took the most risks for the lowest relative pay. By the end of the 1990s, the official death toll was rising, but the unofficial toll was much higher. How many men died of lung cancer 10 years later from the silica dust and diesel particulates they inhaled in those unventilated tunnels? How many died in car accidents driving home after a 20-hour shift? How many took their own lives because the pressure of the anthill became too much to bear? The records don't show those names. The records only show the industrial accidents, the drownings, the falls, the crushings. The engineers will tell you about the technical marvels of the Big Dig. They will talk about the jacked tunnels and the slurry wall construction and the bridge-stayed cables. They will tell you how they moved an entire highway underground without shutting down the city above. And it is a marvel. But they won't talk about Ray Abbott gasping for air in the dark of the harbor. They won't talk about the sound Brian Heffernan made when he hit the deck of the Zakim. They won't talk about Pat Sarney being squeezed to death by a machine in a hole that smelled like rotting earth. As the millennium turned, the project was nearing its structural completion, but the human cost was becoming an open wound. The city was being transformed, the old elevated highway was coming down, and the greenway was beginning to take shape. But for the thousands of men who had spent a decade in the anthill, the scars were permanent. They had traded their youth, their health, and in some cases their lives for a set of tunnels. The contractors continued to push. They were now facing massive fines for every day they were late. Safety inspections were often treated as a formality, a box to be checked on the way to a deadline. The warnings of the workers were ignored. When laborers pointed out leaks in the tunnel walls or cracks in the concrete supports, they were told to keep working. The obsession with project completion had blinded the leadership to the reality of the structure they were building. They were building a tomb, and they were doing it on the backs of men who were too tired to protest. The tragedy in the D Street portal in 2006, where Malna del Val was crushed by 3 tons of concrete, was not an isolated incident. It was the logical conclusion of a decade of cutting corners, ignoring fatigue, and prioritizing speed over human life. The Summer of Blood in 1998 had been the warning shot. The deaths of Abbott, Heffernan, and Sarney were the red flags that the system was broken. But the money was too big. The politics were too loud. Next time you drive through the O'Neill Tunnel or cross the Zakim Bridge, look at the walls. Think about the depth of the earth around you. Think about the fact that you are traveling through a space that was carved out of the mud by men who didn't see their families for weeks at a time. The Big Dig is a testament to human ingenuity, yes, but it is also a monument to human arrogance. It is a place where the lives of the workers were treated as just another line item in a multi-billion-dollar budget. The death toll kept climbing, but the project didn't slow. The Big Dig is a testament to human ingenuity, yes, but it is also a monument to human arrogance. It is a place where the lives of the workers were treated as just another line item in a multi-billion-dollar budget. The death toll kept climbing, but the project didn't slow. As the 1990s bled into the early 2000s, the engineering challenges transitioned from ambitious dreams into a waking nightmare of structural instability and corporate negligence. To understand why people died, you have to understand the ground beneath Boston. The city is built on blue clay and glacial tilla, soft, unstable muck that behaves more like a liquid than a solid when you put the weight of a city on top of it. To cut a highway through this swamp without collapsing the skyscrapers above, the engineers turned to a technique that was as brilliant as it was dangerous: the slurry wall system. Imagine digging a trench 10 stories deep and 3 feet wide, right in the middle of a bustling city. Normally, the walls of that trench would cave in immediately, burying anyone and anything inside. To prevent this, contractors pumped the trench full of slurry, a thick, gray, viscous mixture of bentonite clay and water. This heavy mud exerted enough outward pressure to hold the earth back while the steel cages of the wall were lowered into the muck. Then, they would pump concrete into the bottom of the trench, displacing the slurry and creating a solid underground wall. It was a high-stakes surgical procedure performed on the scale of a mountain. But in the rush to meet the impossible deadlines of the Big Dig, the surgery was botched. If a single pocket of dirt or slurry got trapped in that concrete, it created a honeycomb, a structural void that was invisible from the surface, but as weak as a sponge. These voids were ticking time bombs, buried beneath the water table, waiting for the pressure of the Atlantic Ocean to find a way in. The integrity of these walls depended entirely on the quality of the concrete. This is where the story of the Big Dig shifts from a tragedy of physics to a crime of greed. Enter Bobby Schisler and the Agar Supply Company scandal. While the public was told that the highest standards were being maintained, A quiet conspiracy was unfolding at the concrete mixing plants. Between 1996 and 2005, a company called Augar Supply, led by manager Robert Schisler, systematically defrauded the project. They delivered more than 5,000 loads of substandard concrete to the Big Dig. This wasn't just a minor clerical error. This was a deliberate dilution of the city's foundation. To make the concrete easier to pour and to stretch their profits, they added excessive amounts of water to the mix. In the world of engineering, water is the enemy of strength. Every extra gallon added to a mixer truck weakens the chemical bonds of the concrete. The workers in the tunnels knew something was wrong. They could see the bad concrete, arriving too runny, too gray, lacking the gritty substance required to hold back the crushing weight of the earth. But the trucks kept coming, and the supervisors kept shouting to keep moving. Bobby Schisler and his associates eventually pleaded guilty to these charges, but by the time the FBI stepped in, those 5,000 loads of bad concrete were already deep underground, forming the very walls that were supposed to keep the citizens of Boston safe. The cost-cutting didn't just line the pockets of corrupt managers. It placed a target on the back of every laborer who stepped into those trenches. They were building a tomb, and they were using watered-down mud to do it. The physical toll of this labor cannot be overstated. We often think of construction as a series of mechanical actions, but for the sandhogs, the legendary tunnel workers of the Big Dig, was a war of attrition against the elements. The air in the tunnels was a thick soup of diesel fumes, concrete dust, and the damp, heavy scent of subterranean rot. One man who embodied the spirit and the sacrifice of this work was Jack Bennett. Jack was a foreman, a man who had spent his life in the dirt, leading crews through the most dangerous sections of the project. On October 19, 2002, the pressure finally became too much. Jack Bennett suffered a massive heart attack while working deep within the project's labyrinth. He was 61 years old. In the official records, a heart attack is often listed as natural causes, but there was nothing natural about the conditions Jack Bennett worked in. The extreme stress of managing a crew in a failing tunnel, combined with the crushing heat and the relentless push from management to ignore safety concerns in favor of production, turned the job site into a pressure cooker. Jack didn't die because his heart was weak. He died because the project demanded more than a human body could give. His death was a quiet tragedy, overshadowed by the massive machines and the billion-dollar headlines. But for the men who worked under him, it was a reminder that the Big Dig was eating its own. The negligence of the contractors reached a terrifying peak on the night of September 15, 2004. For years, the oversight firm Bechtel/Parsons-Brinkerhoff had been warned that the slurry walls were moving. Sensors called inclinometers showed that the earth was shifting, pressing against the concrete with more force than the design allowed. The engineers saw the data. They saw the cracks. They saw the weeping walls where salt water from the harbor was already beginning to seep through. Yet they did nothing. They were paralyzed by the fear of delays. Modern Continental, the primary contractor for many of these sections, was chasing millions of dollars in incentive bonuses for hitting milestone dates. If they stopped to fix a wall, they lost the bonus. So they kept digging. That night in September, the ocean finally broke through. In a section of the I-93 northbound tunnel, a slurry wall panel known as Panel 104 simply gave way. It wasn't a slow leak. It was a violent breach. Suddenly, 60,000 gallons of water per hour began roaring into the tunnel. The sound was described by workers as a low, guttural growl that turned into a thunderous crash. A night crew was working just feet away from the breach. Imagine the sheer terror of being hundreds of feet underground, in a dark, cramped tunnel, and hearing the Atlantic Ocean coming for you. The water didn't just flood the floor. It brought with it tons of mud and debris, turning the workspace into a drowning pool. The men scrambled for their lives, wading through waist-deep water as the lights flickered and the structural steel groaned under the sudden shift in pressure. It was a miracle that no one drowned that night, but it was a miracle that should never have been necessary. The breach at Panel 104 was a direct result of the bad concrete and the ignored warnings. When investigators finally looked at the failed section, they found a massive honeycomb of dirt and slurry trapped inside the wall, exactly the kind of defect that Bobby Schisler's watered-down concrete and the rushed pouring schedules were guaranteed to produce. The project was literally rotting from the inside out before it was even finished. Despite these near-catastrophic failures, the public was being sold a very different story. While the tunnels were leaking and the workers were dying, the city was looking upward at the Leonard P. Zakim Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge. It is, by all accounts, a stunning piece of architecture. Its elegant white cables and twin obelisks were designed to evoke the spirit of the American Revolution and the masts of the tall ships that once filled Boston Harbor. It became the face of the big dig, the aesthetic triumph that politicians used to justify the skyrocketing costs and the years of traffic misery. But the Zakim Bridge was a mask. It was a beautiful, soaring distraction from the decay beneath the surface. While the cameras captured the sun glinting off the bridge's cables, the engineers were frantically trying to patch leaks in the tunnels with chemical grout and temporary fixes. The bridge represented the arrogance of the view, the idea that if you make something look grand enough, people will forget to ask if the foundation is solid. But the workers knew. They knew that the bridge was anchored into the same unstable soil and the same compromised management systems that had nearly drowned the night crew in 2004. The contrast was sickening. A billion-dollar monument to progress standing on top of a subterranean disaster waiting to happen. The management culture at Bechtel/Parsons Brinkerhoff and modern Continental created an environment where safety was a secondary concern to the schedule. This is the fundamental corruption of the big dig. When you create a contract where a company earns $5 million for finishing a week early but loses $5 million for finishing a week late, you are putting a price tag on human life. You are telling every foreman and every safety inspector that their concerns are a financial liability. The result was a series of near misses that would have ended any other project. There were reports of falling light fixtures, massive bolts snapping under tension, and ceiling panels that didn't quite fit but were bolted into place anyway. The pressure to complete the central artery was so intense that the basic laws of physics were treated as negotiable. The engineers at BPB were supposed to be the eyes and ears of the public, the final check against contractor greed. Instead, they became enablers. They signed off on change orders that bypassed safety protocols. They looked the other way when the slurry walls showed signs of stress. They prioritized the political survival of the project over the physical survival of the people building it. The technical oversight failure was not an accident. It was a policy. They had spent so much money and so much political capital that the project had become too big to fail, which in reality meant it was too expensive to be safe. As the tunnels finally began to open to traffic in the early 2000s, the atmosphere was not one of relief, but of profound unease among those who had seen the interior of the walls. The workers had seen the voids. They had seen the saltwater stalactites forming on the ceilings. They had seen the stress in the eyes of men like Jack Bennett. They knew that the completion of the project was an illusion. You cannot build a structure this complex with watered-down concrete and ignored warnings and expect it to hold. The ocean is patient. The weight of a city is relentless. The Big Dig was marketed as a way to knit the city back together, to remove the green monster of the old elevated highway and replace it with beautiful parks and efficient tunnels. But as the first cars began to drive through those subterranean passages, they were entering a space that had been compromised by 1,000 small acts of negligence and a dozen major acts of corruption. The engineering challenges had been solved not through superior design, but through sheer force of will and a willingness to gamble with the lives of the public. The true cost of these gambles was about to be paid in the most horrific way imaginable. The near disasters of the construction phase were just a rehearsal for the tragedy that would soon strike the innocent people simply trying to drive home. As completion neared, the true cost was becoming clear. The silence in the boardrooms of Bechtel and Parsons Brinkerhoff was not a silence of ignorance, but a silence of calculation. While the public was told that the delays and the staggering price hikes were simply the cost of doing the impossible, a much more sinister reality was being filed away in cabinets and encrypted in internal memos. The true cost of the Big Dig was being hidden behind a wall of corporate protectionism and political vanity. By the late 1990s, the project was no longer just a construction site. It was a crime scene in the making. The most damning piece of evidence was the epoxy secret. In 1999, 7 years before a single ceiling slab would fall, testing reports landed on the desks of the project managers. These reports were clear. The bolts intended to hold up the massive concrete ceiling panels in the Ted Williams tunnel were slipping. It was called creep, a slow, agonizing failure of the chemical bond between the steel and the concrete. The technicians who performed the tests saw the bolts moving under the weight they were designed to carry. They warned that the epoxy being used was not up to the task, but to stop and replace the adhesive would mean halting construction, admitting a fundamental design flaw, and losing millions in potential management bonuses. Instead of sounding the alarm, the management firms doubled down on a fatal mistake. They authorized the use of fast-set epoxy. In the world of industrial adhesives, speed is often the enemy of durability. The standard epoxy required hours to cure, remaining slightly flexible to handle the vibrations of thousands of heavy trucks and the shifting temperatures of a New England winter. But the fast-set variety was brittle. It cured in minutes, allowing the crews to move faster and the management to claim they were meeting their milestones. It was a chemical gamble played with the lives of every person who would eventually drive through that tunnel. The warnings were buried in files, marked as proprietary information, and shielded from the view of the taxpayers who were footing the multi-billion-dollar bill. While the engineers were burying the structural defects, the management firms were busy orchestrating a financial shell game that would make a Vegas bookie blush. Bechtel and Parsons Brinkerhoff were not just the contractors, they were the joint venture managers. They were essentially being paid to supervise themselves. This conflict of interest allowed them to collect over $2 billion in management fees, while the project's total cost ballooned from $2 billion to nearly $15 billion. Every mistake they made resulted in more work, and every more hour of work resulted in more fees. They were profiting from their own incompetence. When structural defects like the leaking, slurry walls, or the slipping bolts were discovered, they weren't treated as failures to be rectified at the contractor's expense. They were treated as unforeseen conditions that required more taxpayer funding to fix. It was a cycle of legalized graft that bled the city dry while the very foundation of the project was rotting from within. But the cost of the big dig wasn't just measured in dollars and defective epoxy. It was measured in the erasure of entire communities. For decades, the North End had been the vibrant, beating heart of Boston's Italian-American community. It was a place of multi-generational families, where the streets smelled of roasting coffee and Sunday gravy, and where neighbors looked out for one another from their tenement windows. When the original elevated central artery was built in the 1950s, it had sliced the North End off from the rest of the city like a jagged scar. The Big Dig promised to heal that wound by putting the highway underground and creating a greenway on top. The reality was a different kind of destruction. As the project neared completion, the land values around the new tunnel portals and the proposed park skyrocketed. The very families who had endured 30 years of soot, noise, and construction rats were suddenly find themselves priced out of their own neighborhood. Property taxes doubled, then tripled. Landlords who had held onto buildings for 60 years saw the dollar signs and sold to developers who had no interest in the local culture. The North End began to transform from a living neighborhood into a sterile playground for the wealthy. The little Italy that had survived the Great Depression and World War II was being slowly dismantled by the very project that claimed to be saving it. The displacement wasn't a side effect. For the developers and politicians, it was the goal. They wanted the new Boston, and the old Italian grandmothers on Salem Street were simply in the way of the luxury condos. To the south, Chinatown was being forced to make an even more visceral sacrifice. If the North End was being gentrified, Chinatown was being suffocated. The Big Dig required massive ventilation shafts to pump the toxic exhaust out of the tunnels. These shafts weren't placed in the wealthy neighborhoods of the Back Bay or the financial district. They were placed in Chinatown. Massive, monolithic concrete towers rose up over the narrow streets, acting as the lungs of the city, but lungs that only exhaled. The air quality in the neighborhood plummeted. Rates of asthma and respiratory illness among the elderly residents and the children who played in the local parks began to climb. Chinatown's local businesses, many of them family-owned for decades, were physically cut off by construction walls and no parking zones that lasted for years. The neighborhood was treated as a dumping ground for the project's most intrusive elements. Ramps were built that funneled thousands of cars directly into the heart of the community, destroying the walkability that had been the lifeblood of the area. The leaders of the Big Dig spoke about mitigation, but for the people of Chinatown, mitigation was just a fancy word for a slow-motion eviction. They were being told to breathe the fumes of the city's progress so that suburban commuters could shave 10 minutes off their drive. The West End, a neighborhood that had already been decimated by the urban renewal projects of the 1950s, faced its final erasure. The Big Dig didn't just pass through the West End, it consumed what little was left of its historic footprint. The project replaced the old tenement history with a labyrinth of sterile ramps and looming high-rises. The scale of the construction was so massive that it distorted the very geography of the area. What was once a dense network of human-scale streets became a transitional zone, a place to be moved through, not lived in. The displacement here was total. The history of the immigrant families who had built the West End was paved over with smooth asphalt and decorated with luxury branding that bore no resemblance to the people who had once called it home. Throughout all of this, there was a deafening silence from the very people who knew the most about the danger, the unions. The thousands of laborers, carpenters, and ironworkers who spent their days in the mud and the dark of the tunnels saw the corners being cut. They saw the substandard materials. They saw the fast-set epoxy being slapped onto the bolts. They knew that the ceiling panels, each weighing several tons, were being held up by hope and a prayer. But in the world of Boston construction, silence is a commodity. The project was the largest employer in the region. To speak out was to be blacklisted. To question the safety of the materials was to be labeled a troublemaker and sent to the back of the hiring hall. The management firms used trade secret clauses and non-disclosure agreements to ensure that the systemic dangers remained hidden. Even the union leadership, often more concerned with the steady flow of dues and political influence than the long-term safety of the infrastructure, kept their heads down. They were partners in the project, and in that partnership, the lives of the workers and the future drivers were treated as acceptable risks. The culture of shut up and dig was enforced from the top down, creating a situation where the men and women building the tunnel were the very ones most aware that they were building a tomb. The corruption wasn't just in the money, it was in the documentation. Every time a safety inspector raised a concern about the structural integrity of the tunnel roof, the report was reviewed and amended by the management firms before it reached the state oversight boards. The official death toll of the construction phase, the 4 men who died in direct accidents, was a carefully curated number. It didn't account for the workers who died years later from the silica dust they inhaled in the unventilated shafts. It didn't account for the suicides of men who were broken by the grueling, high-pressure environment of a project that was always behind schedule and over budget. By the time the final sections of the tunnel were being prepared for their grand opening, the cover-up was complete. The slips in the bolts had been documented, ignored, and then hidden behind layers of fireproofing and decorative panels. The displacement of the Italian families in the North End, the poisoning of the air in Chinatown, and the final destruction of the West End were all framed as the necessary growing pains of a world-class city. The politicians were ready for their ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The contractors were ready to collect their final bonuses and move on to the next project. The stage was set for a celebration of American ingenuity. The structure opened to celebration. Nobody mentioned the bodies buried in the foundation. Nobody mentioned the 5-ton slabs of concrete hanging over the heads of the public, held in place by an adhesive that everyone in the boardroom knew was failing. As the first thousands of cars began to flow through the heart of Boston, the creep continued. Millimeter by millimeter, the bolts were sliding out of the concrete. The countdown had begun, and the people of Boston were driving into a trap that had been built with their own money and sealed with a lie. The true cost of the Big Dig was not just the billions of dollars or the years of traffic. It was the fundamental betrayal of the public trust. It was the decision that a management fee was worth more than a human life. It was the cold-blooded calculation that some neighborhoods were worth saving and others were meant to be sacrificed. As the lights flickered in the new tunnels and the ventilation shafts began to hum, the city looked forward to a new era. But beneath the surface, the rot was already set. The tragedy that was about to unfold wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a decade of deception. The bills were about to come due, and they would be paid in blood. Next time you drive through a multi-billion-dollar tunnel, remember that the smooth walls often hide a history of silenced warnings and displaced lives. Remember that the progress you enjoy was built on the ruins of neighborhoods that were deemed expendable. The Big Dig was marketed as a miracle, but for the people who lived in its shadow and the workers who saw its secrets, it was a slow-motion disaster. The structure opened to celebration. Nobody mentioned the bodies buried in the foundation. Next time you use this structure, remember the workers who paid with their lives. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried. December 31st, 2007. On paper, this was the day the Big Dig finally ended. After 25 years of planning and construction, after billions of dollars in overruns, and after a trail of blood that stretched from the harbor to the suburbs, the most expensive highway project in human history was declared officially complete. There were no grand parades. There were no triumphant speeches under the sun. Instead, there was a hollow, exhausted silence. The politicians who had once scrambled for a spot at the ribbon cutting were now nowhere to be found. They didn't want their faces associated with a project that had become a national punchline for corruption and a local monument to tragedy. They had moved on to higher offices or lucrative private sector consultancies, leaving the city of Boston to live with the consequences of their ambition. The celebration was a lie because the Big Dig has never truly ended. Even as the final orange cones were cleared, the tunnels were already failing. The ceilings were leaking, the steel was rusting, and the very ground beneath the city was shifting in ways the engineers had promised it wouldn't. But while the newspapers focused on the escalating price tag, they often skipped over the names of the men who were still paying the price with their lives right up until the bitter end. We talk about the project as a monumental achievement of engineering, but for the families of Michael Mickey McNeil and Stephen J. Mayer, it was nothing more than a graveyard. Michael Mickey McNeil was a 48-year-old electrician from South Boston. He was a man who knew the city's bones, a veteran of the trades who had spent years navigating the damp, claustrophobic labyrinths beneath the surface. In September of 2004, as the project was supposedly winding down, McNeil was working on a lighting project inside the Ted Williams Tunnel. He was standing on a motorized lift, doing the kind of routine maintenance that keeps a city breathing. In an instant, the machine tipped. There was no time to jump, no time to scream. Mickey McNeil fell 30 feet to the concrete floor. He died because of a mechanical failure on a project that had become so bloated and chaotic that even basic equipment safety had become an afterthought. His death didn't stop the machines. It didn't even make the front page for more than a day. He was just another number added to the ledger of progress. Less than a year later, in July of 2005, Stephen J. Mayer became the final official casualty of the construction phase. He was 52 years old, a hard-working member of the laborers' union who had survived the most dangerous years of the dig only to be killed by a forklift accident in the home stretch. Think about that for a moment. These men weren't killed by a massive tunnel collapse or a spectacular engineering failure. They were killed by the mundane, grinding hazards of a workplace that had been under high pressure, fast-track orders for nearly 2 decades. When you rush a project for 20 years, safety isn't a priority, it is a hurdle. And when the project is billions of dollars over budget, the first thing to be squeezed is the time and equipment needed to keep workers like Mickey and Stephen alive. The official death toll stands at 4 workers and 1 motorist, Milna Del Val. But if you talk to the men who were in those tunnels, they will tell you the real number is much higher. They talk about the unofficial deaths, the heart attacks brought on by 80-hour work weeks in stagnant, diesel-choked air. They talk about the suicides of men who lost their businesses or their sanity to the decades of construction noise and vibration. They talk about the slow deaths from lung disease and cancers that are only now, 20 years later, starting to claim the men who breathed in the dust of Boston's underbelly. These deaths don't make the official reports because they didn't happen on the clock, but they are just as much a part of the Big Dig's cost as the concrete and the steel. And then, there is the financial ghost that haunts every resident of Massachusetts today. The original estimate for the Big Dig was $2.6 billion. By the time the final interest payment is made in 2038, the total cost will exceed $24 billion. That is a staggering, incomprehensible amount of money. To put it in perspective, every man, woman, and child in the state is carrying thousands of dollars in debt for a road they might not even use. But the real tragedy isn't just the debt. It's what that money could have built instead. For 20 years, every other infrastructure project in the state was cannibalized to feed the Big Dig. The subway system, the MBTA, was left to rot. Bridges in the western part of the state were allowed to crumble. Schools went unbuilt. The Big Dig was a black hole that swallowed the future of an entire generation's infrastructure. Also, a few miles of highway could be moved underground. Today, we are seeing the same patterns emerge across the country, and the warnings of the Big Dig are being ignored. Look at the California high-speed rail project. It began with a promise of $9 billion and a completion date in the early 2000s. Today, the cost has ballooned past $100 billion, and there is still no clear end in sight. The same culture of lowballing, the initial bid to get political approval, followed by fast-tracking construction to meet arbitrary deadlines, is playing out in real time. In New York and New Jersey, the Gateway Tunnel project faces the same pressures. We are told these projects are too big to fail, which is just another way of saying they are too expensive to be safe. The federal government is currently pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into new infrastructure through the latest funding bills. They use words like shovel-ready and expedited delivery. Those are the same words they used in 1991. When you prioritize speed and political optics over the slow, methodical work of safety and oversight, you aren't just building a tunnel, you are building a trap. The culture of the big dig where contractors were allowed to self-inspect their work, and where thousands of tons of concrete were poured without proper testing, is still alive and well in the modern construction industry. We are still using the same high-performance epoxy bolts that failed and killed Milne del Val, and we are still trusting the same corporations that prioritize their profit margins over the thickness of a ceiling slab. As you drive through the O'Neill Tunnel today, you see the smooth walls and the bright lights, and it's easy to forget what lies behind the panels. But you should look closer. Look at the water stains on the walls. Look at the sections of the ceiling that have been reinforced with unsightly steel brackets. This is a structure that is in a constant state of repair, a multi-billion-dollar patient on permanent life support. It is a monument to the fact that you cannot cheat engineering, and you cannot cheat the cost of human life. We must remember the names. We must remember James Rovero, who was crushed by a crane in the early days. We must remember the unnamed divers who risked the bends in the freezing waters of the harbor. We must remember the residents of the North End and South Boston whose neighborhoods were sliced open and left to bleed for 20 years. And we must remember Milne del Val, whose life was ended because a company decided that a few $100s worth of the wrong glue was good enough for government work. The legacy of the Big Dig is not the park that sits on top of the highway. It is not the reduced commute times or the increased property values in the seaport. The true legacy is a warning. It is a warning that when greed meets political ego, the workers and the public are the ones who pay the bill. It is a warning that a high-performance, epoxy bolt is never a substitute for human integrity. The total cost of the Big Dig was $24 billion, 5 confirmed deaths, and thousands of lives displaced or destroyed by decades of corruption and neglect. It stands as the most expensive highway in the world, built on a foundation of lies, and the backs of men who were told their safety was a secondary concern to the schedule. Next time you cross the Leonard P. Zachem Bunker Hill Bridge or drive through the Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. Tunnel, remember the faces of the men like Michael McNeil and Stephen Mayer. Remember that the ground you are driving on was bought with debt, that your children will still be paying off long after you are gone. Remember that every inch of that tunnel was a battleground between the people who wanted to build it right and the people who wanted to build it fast. Next time you use the Big Dig, remember the workers who paid with their lives. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried.